may I reach heaven's joys, oh bright heaven's sun. Thou art my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, oh ruler of all. Be seated. From Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves, and they did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. It started like any other day. Hundreds of days had started just like this. The disciples did not think anything strange would happen this day. Jesus had said to them, at least 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, "Come on, let's go up to the mountaintop to pray." I don't think that when Jesus said that to them, they thought anything about it. This was not unusual. When you read the Gospels, especially Luke is very impressed and very focused on the prayer life of Jesus. I think the disciples witnessed Jesus pray many, many times. In fact, Luke tells us that the disciples were so caught up in Jesus' praying that one time they went to Jesus to ask him, "Lord, teach us how to pray." Wouldn't it have been amazing to have witnessed Jesus praying, talking about pure bliss, pure static-free communication between earth and heaven? So when Jesus says to Peter, James, and John, "Let's go up on the mountain and pray," I don't think they thought anything about it. They climb a mountain. History says it was Mount Tabor, although some want to argue and say it was Mount Hermon. Doesn't really matter. They went up on the mountain, and Jesus begins to pray, and Peter, James, and John do what they always do, it seems, when Jesus starts to pray. They fall asleep. So, as Jesus is praying, as they're taking their little nap, something absolutely astounding happens. Jesus is transfigured. He's changed. He's different. His face starts to glow, starts to shine. His clothes, Mark says, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three tell this story. So if I insert some details that you don't remember in the reading, it's from one of the other Gospels. But Mark says that his clothes became white like they had been bleached with the greatest bleach there ever was. It's amazing what God did on that mountain. Jesus' clothes shine. Jesus' face shines. Then appears beside Jesus Moses and Elijah. By this time, the disciples are awake. And by this time, they are looking at this event and they do not know what to think. That would have been a really good time to have kept silent. But you know Peter. Peter never wasted a moment to say something when he shouldn't have. Wouldn't you hate to have somebody read 2,000 years after your death a passage about you saying something and then in parentheses it says, he did not know what he was saying? But that's what we read about Peter in today's text. Peter said, it's good that we are here. Let's build 3 shelters, God. Jesus, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And at that moment, a cloud comes. And they're terrified. When I read this text, my mind goes back to Exodus. When Moses was up on the mountain receiving the 10 commandments, and there was thunder, and there was lightning, and there was a cloud, and all of Israel became afraid. From this cloud, when Jesus is transfigured, comes a voice. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And when the cloud lifts, Jesus is standing there alone. Luke says that these 3 disciples did not tell anyone what they had seen. Some other Gospels say that Jesus told them, don't tell what you have just seen until after the Son of Man has risen from the dead. It's a weird story. It's an unusual story. But it makes it in the final draft of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it must be an important story. There must be some lesson that the gospel writers wanted us to get from this story. What is it? Well, I think to truly understand this story, we must put it in context. We must look back to the previous chapters and see what has been going on. We are told in all 3 gospel accounts that Jesus and his disciples have come to Caesarea Philippi. And it's at that place that Jesus asked his disciples a question. A very important question. Jesus says to them, who do people say that I am? Remember that story? And they gave him the answers that was going around. There must have been some kind of buzz in the air. And they said, well, some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're another prophet. And that must have been correct because Jesus didn't correct them. But then Jesus gets very pointed. And Jesus says, but who do you? Talking to his disciples. Who do you think I am? Well, you know who spoke up first, who always spoke up first. Peter. And Peter said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, Peter, you're right. And flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. Peter was on the mountaintop with his answer. Finally, he speaks up and he gets something right. Then Jesus says to his disciples, now I'm going to be going to Jerusalem. And when I get to Jerusalem, I am going to be mocked. I am going to be killed. but I am going to rise again. That would have been a real good point for Peter to have kept his mouth shut. He had just really had a mountaintop experience. He had just gotten an A from Jesus. But Peter speaks up. No, that's not going to happen, Jesus. I will not allow that to happen. In fact, one of the gospel writers says that Peter rebuked the Lord. And if you remember the story, you remember what Jesus calls Peter. Get behind me. Now, it's translated many times in our English Bible, Satan, literally, get behind me, you tempter. From one moment getting praise to the next moment being called Satan, Peter sure had his mountaintops and his valleys. But Peter, at that moment, he gets the answer right. But you know what? I don't think he had a clue as to what it meant. Jesus was the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one. And by the way, Christ was not Jesus' last name. Christ was his title. The word Christ means Messiah or anointed one, the promised one that the prophets had foretold. And Peter knew that's who Jesus was. But Peter had no idea what that meant. You have heard me say this before, if you listen. The hardest and longest trip you will ever make is from here I know to here I know. Peter in the previous chapters says right here, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But it has yet to travel to here. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. What is it going to take for Peter to make that trip from here to here? I think that's why we have this story in our text today. I think that's why the gospel writers recount this story. Because it's on this mountain, this time of transfiguration, that God reveals to Peter, James and John, and you and me, what it really means for Jesus to be the Christ, the Messiah. And I think God does that in three ways. First of all, through the event of the transfiguration itself. I can only imagine what these disciples were feeling when they look up and they see that Jesus' countenance has changed. I'm kind of shocked that the disciples did not have trouble with their eyes in this moment. Because do you remember when Paul was on the road to Damascus and he sees the glory of Jesus? It's a bright, shining light. Remember what happens to Paul? Paul is blinded by the glory of God. Now, these disciples have heard the stories of Moses. They know when Moses came down from the mountain, receiving the Ten Commandments, after he had been with God in God's presence for 40 days. Remember what had happened to Moses? I guess you don't. Moses' face was shining. Moses' face was shining, and it scared the Israelites to death. I won't even ask if you remember what Moses did because of it. But Moses put on a veil. And whenever he spoke to the Israelites after that, he wore that veil. So when Moses sees the glory of God, he shines. When Paul sees the glory of Jesus, he is blinded. I am shocked that that did not happen to these three disciples. Because they saw Jesus as Jesus truly was. One thing that always makes me scratch my head when I read this story, I told you Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three recorded. You know who does not record it? John. You know who was there? John. It would make so much sense for John to have recorded it in his gospel. He was there. But he didn't. He didn't mention it at all. Or did he? Or did he? One of my favorite verses to quote at Christmas time. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. When John wrote those words, did his mind go back to that mountaintop? I don't think John ever forgot that experience. I don't think Peter ever forgot that experience. I don't think James ever forgot that experience, because for the first time they see Jesus unfiltered. Unfiltered. You know, the first time I saw the courthouse in Mayberry in a color episode, it was very different, wasn't it? Do you remember? You know, you see all these Andy Griffith shows, and they're in black and white, and you picture for yourself what color the courthouse would be. And I remember when I saw it in the first color episode, you know, I was like, what? It just didn't look right. It was different than I had expected. I think the disciples, when they really see Jesus as he was, I think they were stunned. I think they were surprised. But I don't think they ever forgot it. For God was showing them exactly what the Messiah was. The Messiah was God. The Messiah was light. The Messiah was God's glory. The second thing that I think God is teaching Peter, James, and John and us happens when Moses and Elijah appear. Whenever in the New Testament you see Moses, in your mind, I always want you to think law. Moses always represents the law. In fact, many times we refer to the law as the law of Moses. Elijah always represents the prophets. Always in the New Testament. One amazing thing about this passage, when Moses comes down the mountain for meeting with God, Moses' face is shining. When Jesus is on the mountain transfigurated, Jesus is shining. When Elijah is taken up into heaven, do you remember how God came to get Elijah? A chariot of fire. Don't you bet Elijah was shining as he left this world. But here they are, Jesus in the middle, and Moses on one side, and Elijah on the other side. What is God telling us? What is God showing us? The reason Moses was there was because Moses represented the law. Do you remember what the purpose of the law was? The purpose of the law was to show us and remind us and convince us that God's standard of holiness is something we cannot achieve. The purpose of the law was to show us that we are sinners. The purpose of the prophets were the mouthpiece of God. And the prophets' purpose was to tell us, to tell Israel specifically, but to tell the readers as well, that because we cannot achieve the holiness of God, because God's standard is up here and our performance is down here, and we can never get up there, God will send a perfect sacrifice for us. Moses showed us we needed the sacrifice with the law. The prophets show us that the sacrifice will come. Now, on one side of Jesus, we see Moses. On the other side of Jesus, we see Elijah. And in the middle, there is the one who can fulfill the law. And there in the middle is the one who will fulfill all of the prophecies. So God is saying, Peter, Jesus is the Christ. But Peter, that means he is my glory. Peter, that means he is the one who is going to usher in the new covenant. In the Old Testament, the covenant was written on stone. In the New Testament, the covenant is written on our hearts. In the Old Testament, the covenant was laws, rules, regulations. In the New Testament, the covenant is a relationship with the Messiah. Now, the third thing God does in this passage is God speaks. God speaks from the cloud. You probably recognize those words. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. It's almost exactly the same announcement that God makes when Jesus is baptized. The only thing God does is God adds the words, listen to him. Now I think that Jesus needed to hear those words as much as Peter, James, and John did. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the words are spoken at the two times Jesus will need them the most. At Jesus' baptism, when Jesus is beginning his ministry, when he is going to leave the comforts of home, when he's going to leave the comforts of his surroundings, and he is going to start a new dimension of his life, he hears the words, you are my son, I'm proud of you, and I love you. And now, from Luke chapter 9 to the end of the chapter, it's one trip to Jerusalem. In Luke chapter 9, we will find the words that he set his eyes on Jerusalem. That means there was no turning back. That means from this moment on, he was destined to die. He's going to need courage. He's going to need strength. And I think those words from God the Father gave him the very things he needed. And I think it gave the disciples what they needed too. Because this means that Jesus was who he said he was. Too often I hear the words, yes, Jesus was a great man. Yes, Jesus was a prophet, but he wasn't God. But if Jesus wasn't God, and he did claim to be, if he wasn't God, then he was not a good man. And he was not a prophet, because he was wrong about everything. If he was not God, that he was God. So what does that mean? We can listen to him. We can trust him. You know, the road for these disciples was not going to be easy. Jesus was going to be killed. Jesus was going to be crucified. And God knew that these disciples were going to be next. And God knew that they needed to be able to trust the words of Jesus. And God knew that one day you and I would be on this journey called the Christian life. And it would be tough for us too. And God knew that we need to listen to Jesus too. When you're tired and want to give up and weary, you can listen and you can trust Jesus when he says, come unto me, all of you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. When you've lost your way and you don't know what way to turn, you can listen and you can trust Jesus. When Jesus says, I'm the light of the world, when everything seems dark, there's the light. It'll point you the way. When you don't know how to live the Christian life, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You need the way, come follow me. On that mountain, God was telling Peter, Peter, you're right. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter, you're right. That's who he is. Peter, there's going to become a time, though, when you've got to get it from here to here. And that means you've got to come to believe that he is God's glory. He is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And you can trust him. Did Peter get there? Well, eventually. It took a while, but he did get there. But you have heard me say, if you listen, the Christian life is a process. A process by which the Holy Spirit comes to live inside of you. And there will be ups, and there will be downs. And there will be times you get it right. And there will be times you fall on your face. And those times when you get it right, you can trust God. And you can listen to Jesus and you can know. And you can know that you're on the right path. In those moments when you fall flat on your face, you can trust God and you can listen to Jesus and you can have the faith and the courage to get up again and start moving again. Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the Messiah. Believe it and live it. It'll make a big difference. Let us stand and affirm our faith. Using the words of the historical Apostles' Creed.